Good. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and thank you for joining us online. I think we should begin. I'm very pleased to introduce the speaker today, Professor Sonia Sikka from the University of Ottawa, where she's the professor of philosophy. Primary areas of research are social and political philosophy, philosophy of religion, German philosophy, and her current research involves the political management of religious and cultural diversity, with focus on Canada and India. Professor Sikka also works on critical philosophy of race, including racism in the history of philosophy, participates in collaborative efforts to multiculturalize the philosophy of religion as an academic field. Recent essays include Religious Freedom or Multiculturalism, Quebec and Antarctica as case studies, which is forthcoming in Religious Freedom and Accommodating Religious Diversity. Another one is Religious Freedom and Sacred Lands, forthcoming in the Journal of Law and Religion. And also, philosophy of religion racist? Indian Islamophobia as racism, which actually was in a special issue edited by Thomas Seeley and I on racism and anti-racism in Asia and the Middle East in the Political Quarterly last year. So we're very pleased to have you here, Sonia, and the title of the talk is Multiculturalism as Anti-Racism. Before I hand over to Sonia, I'll just say that there will be a drinks reception. It won't be outside because something else is happening outside. It'll be in the Psychology Common Room. And Lauren,
who's just through the cafe to the side, so I can direct everyone there.
Lauren will guide us there. So please do stay for a drink and a conversation and a chance to speak to Professor Sikka at the end. So thank you very much, Sonia. Over to you.
Thank you. So I want to thank you, Tariq, for inviting me to this, and to all of you for coming at what I know is a pretty busy time of the semester. I just pull up my
Screen share. 1 second. You mind? Sorry about this. Why can't I? Yeah, did I speak? Okay, we'll copy that.
Okay, so yeah, my abstract started with the line, some critics of multiculturalism in Canada have claimed that it fails to address racism or distracts from a focus on anti-racist analyses and proposals. A blog post that I found, this isn't moving. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Blog post series published in 2020 that I came across called Multiculturalism is Not Anti-Racism, posted in the form of 4 short essays by Khadija Kanji, makes this point nicely. And I want to start with it, not with the intent of criticizing the author, who is well-intentioned and makes her case with reference to academic literature and statements by Kassan Hage, Himani Banerjee, Deepa Kumar, Tayayaki Alford, Bonita Lawrence, and Inakshi Dua, and so on. But I wanted to start with it because I thought this blog neatly brings together the kinds of criticisms that anti-racists, particularly in Canada, have made of multiculturalism. And also, while its title seems to oppose the case that I want to make, actually, I do sympathize with much of what the author and the literature she references has to say. The claims about the situation of racialized minorities in Canada, the descriptive claims are, I think, accurate enough. I don't think multiculturalism is quite so much to blame as the author argues. Multiculturalism as a policy, governmental policy, but I do think multicultural theory needs to take on board these realities and hasn't adequately done so. And I'm talking particularly about Canadian multicultural theory. So, because it hasn't done so, sometimes it can be true that in practice, quote, multicultural discourse is more effective at obscuring racism than it is at addressing it, as the author says. I don't think that has to be true of multicultural theory. Okay, so I wanted to run through these points because I think it's, as I said, a nice summary of what the anti-racist critique of multiculturalism has been. So her first little essay was called Multicultural Immigration is Not Racial Benevolence. And so one issue she raises is that of temporary workers and non-white immigrants generally, noting the persistence of economic exploitation and inequalities, the securitization of racial others, and the gap between these facts and some self-congratulatory perceptions and discourses in Canada. This, for example, from a newspaper article by a well-known Canadian columnist, John Ibbotson. Canada can make an honest claim to being the most open-minded and open-hearted place on earth. No country brings in as many immigrants as we do on a per capita basis from as many different places. That last bit is true, but not all immigrants do that well, and not all immigrants are treated equally. To be fair, in the article being cited, Ibbotson attributes Canadian tolerance and what he sees as Canada's successful integration of immigrants to luck, not generosity. He notes that Canada is bordered by 3 oceans. We are very, very far away from anywhere except the United States. Few illegal migrants seep through our undefended southern border. Few boat people land on our shores, few refugee claimants arrive at our airports, and so on. And as some other critics, for instance, critics of Will Kymlicka have noted, Canada has, yes, it takes a very high number of immigrants on a per capita basis, but it takes a majority of them on a monopoint system, which screens for instance, education and knowledge proficiency. And yeah, it is going to be the case that immigrants with a high level of education, professional background often, and a good French or English skills are going to integrate economically rather well, right? Nonetheless, Ibbotson does affirm that Canada is relatively good at integrating and offering equality to immigrants, and he does attribute this alleged success to multiculturalism. And he in turn connects that success with the nature of the nation's founding. The fact that it required a union of French and English populations, sub-nations, as he terms it. I am actually quite doubtful that the historical French-English compact has much to do with the successes, such as they are, of Canadian multiculturalism as a policy directed towards non-white, using white as a constructed category, of course, as non-white citizens and residents, whether immigrant groups or First Nations. Nor, in my view, is multiculturalism understood in terms of that French-English compact particularly helpful for anti-racism. In fact, I think it can be positively unhelpful to reference the case of Quebec and the fact that Canada is, bilingual and binational. It can be unhelpful because it doesn't help us to thematize, and so can indeed obscure crucial dimensions of the situation of racialized minorities within Canada and other majority white countries. So it's true, I think, that this analysis of the connection between multiculturalism and racial equality in Canada is flawed. It's also true that at a descriptive level, of course, multicultural diversity is not racial equality. The fact that non-white people are present and tolerated does not mean they are treated equally. And yeah, it's to the extent that it does not address racism, talk about racism, it is possible that multiculturalism, understood in some way, facilitates the maintenance of white privilege by obscuring the reality of ongoing racial distinctions, maintained for the most part without the active invocation of race. Black Canadians, for instance, as the author notes, do face de facto segregation, disproportionate incarceration and policing, being relegated to low-paying jobs. Although I don't quite know what it means or what to make of the statement that culture is invoked to signal deviation from an unstated but implicit norm of white Westernness. It is, yes, that discourse of culture, but is deployed in the form of neo or cultural racism, right? Rather than multiculturalism. And I think it needs to be part of what multiculturalism addresses, although multicultural theory in Canada often does not. Okay, still, some of the racism in Canada in relation to Black people, for instance, is straightforward anti-Black racism, which needs to be recognized as such and sometimes isn't. Although it's not as extreme as the US, Canada does have its own history of enslavement, indentured service, and segregation, which we tend to gloss over by saying, well, you know, we don't have a history of slavery and enslaved Africans in the US fled to Canada, which yes, sometimes they did. They still met with racism. Okay, so there is that. Third point this author makes is that multiculturalism can't defeat xenophobia. And here she cites Hage. Both white racists and white multiculturalists share in a conception of the nation as a space structured around a white culture, where Aboriginal people and non-white ethnics are merely national objects to be moved or removed according to a white national will. This is a fair point, and also this point about values tests for immigrants, proposed values tests for immigrants. These are a reality so far only in Quebec. They are indeed based on the assumption that existing Canadians carry the same set of values and that society is only functional because of this loosely defined shared morality. They scrutinize immigrants in a way that naturalized Canadians are not. So, you know, naturalized Canadians are not asked about their views on gender equality, for instance, or LGBTQ rights. Right, and it's also true that the dominant discourse advanced by mainstream media is often racist, inclined to over-report on acts of terrorism, quote unquote, committed by Muslims, while under-reporting on those against Muslims. And as polls show, most Canadians are both proud of multiculturalism and deny the seriousness of Islamophobia, which doesn't make multiculturalism as a political policy responsible for increasing Islamophobia, though. But I'll return to that. Okay, finally, she says multiculturalism is not decolonization. And from here, I'll segue into why I think anti-racism nonetheless has to talk about culture. She mentions the colonial myth of terra nullius, that is the denial of Indigenous presence. Terra nullius means no one's land, right? The denial of Indigenous presence that legitimized settler occupation. On this point, she quotes Tayayaki Alford, Canada's basic policies of assimilation and destruction remain unchanged. The government continues to divest responsibility for the effects of colonialism on Aboriginal peoples while holding onto their land base and resources, redefining without reforming and further entrenching in law and practice the real basis of its powers. And so, yeah, is it, I think, okay, and so she therefore claims, it's not Alfred, therefore claims that multiculturalism abets rather than disrupts colonialism by culturalizing Indigenous peoples within a pluralist framework so that their unique claims against the Canadian state are sidelined. I think multicultural theory can do that if it treats Indigenous peoples as a culturally distinct sub-nation or national minority that is akin to, say, Quebec. So yeah, that can be a problem. She knows that she makes mention of inadequate funding for Indigenous languages to overcome linguistic genocide, and notes that the multicultural promise of religious freedom also has not been fulfilled towards Indigenous peoples. And she mentions the Chunaha decision, on which I've written a bit. So let me talk a little about that, because I think it's quite an interesting case. This was a Supreme Court case judging the British Columbia Chunaha Nation's demand to stop the construction of a ski resort in an area of land that they regard as sacred. It was the first case of its kind in Canada of an Indigenous community seeking to prevent unwanted development on traditional lands through appeal to religious freedom. There have been a number of such cases in the US, virtually all unsuccessful, as the Chunaha's case was in Canada. It was unsuccessful, that is, at the level of the court. So yeah, what the court said was, I mean, they actually did recognize that that Indigenous religions are different, and that from Christianity or Islam, and that a place can be sacred. But they said they were asking for something novel, that they were asking for the protection of grizzly bear spirit, and the court concluded that religious freedom protects the freedom to believe and to manifest those beliefs. It does not protect the object of those beliefs. So in the court's interpretation, they wanted to protect grizzly bear spirit, and that the court said they could not do, not via religious freedom anyway. Okay, so yeah, so they were unsuccessful at the level of the courts, but they were successful outside of the courts. They lost their battle in court, but they won the war. When the Justin Trudeau government was elected, this area that they regard as sacred was designated as protected under a new model, IPCA, meaning Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area. It's like a protected national park, but under but it's Indigenous led in its governance. Now, it's fair in a way to see the Canadian Supreme Court judgment against the Chunaha's claim as reflecting racism of a systemic and largely unconscious type. Systemic is really the better word. But we should notice that challenging that racism requires talking about culture from a number of directions. One is that culture was an integral part of the Chunaha's case, because that case invoked a different relation to land than the one underlying, underlying laws of European provenance. And this has been true of Native American cases appealing to religious freedom to protect sacred land as well. You know, these cases, they proceed through religious freedom because that's one of the few avenues that's open to Indigenous peoples to protect lands they regard as sacred, which are part of their traditional lands, but then over which they no longer have jurisdiction, right? So they go that way, but it's not that religious freedom is a very good fit for what it is that they're trying to assert. Consider this statement by the Chunaha, which was presented to a provincial court at an earlier stage of their legal battle. And it's about Kymlicka, the sacred area that they sought to protect. And, you know, they're trying to explain their relation to this area. And they said that their language doesn't translate well into other languages, meaning the language of the courts, right? Meaning English or French. And consequently, our spiritual relation with Kymlicka may not be fully understood by others. There's no word for religion in their languages, as in most Indigenous languages. Spiritual is translating, I don't know what, probably there's no precise word that means spiritual either. They make the point that Kymlicka's importance for the grizzly bear spirit is inextricably interlinked with its importance for living grizzly bears now and in the future. They have a stewardship obligation and duty to the grizzly bear spirit and Kymlicka. So they're concerned to protect the species, grizzly bears, and their rights surrounding grizzly bear spirit were closely interlinked. They were joined in this struggle by environmentalists, nature conservationists, as Indigenous people often are in these sacred land cases. We were born into this land, and someday we will return through death. The Creator put us here for a reason, and that purpose is to take care of the land and its resources. So they have a certain covenant with the Creator to protect and not overuse the land. And I mean, the way that I interpret this kind of religious language is always to think about, well, I mean, it's human beings who wrote it, right? So what is it expressing, right? What is it expressing about their worldview, their being in the world? Well, that they have a responsibility, right, to take care of the land. And often, for many Indigenous traditions, is to take care of the land up to the 7th generation. So you're supposed to think 7 generations ahead in what you do now. The law is grounded in the fact that all things are connected and must be kept in balance. It's also the foundation of our spirituality, that of being humble in our limited understanding and of being respectful of our role within nature and with other creatures, as well as being respectful and acknowledging the Creator and our ancestors. Okay, so, the court judged that they wanted to protect grizzly bear spirit and the subjective spiritual meaning they derive from it, was the language of the Supreme Court's reasoning in delivering their decision. That's really a rather simplistic and reductive understanding of the meaning of grizzly bear spirit and just everything that's connected with it. I think although it's a reductive understanding of how these rituals are associated, bound up with the relationship of reciprocal belonging, respect, and stewardship between the Ktunaxa and this precise region, which forms part of their traditional lands that are, however, now crown lands, and so under the jurisdiction of the Canadian government. The other critical issue here, of course, is the settler colonial history through which Indigenous nations were dispossessed of their lands in the first place. As Kymlicka and Look, writing on this case, say in analyzing the decision, well, dominant religious groups do not face the same difficulty as Indigenous peoples, since they already own the land on which their sacred sites, churches, cemeteries, so on, are located. Racism was, of course, central to the process of settler colonial appropriation of Indigenous territories, including ideas about the native inhabitants of the Americas being savages, which equates their societies with primitive stages of human development, using a trope about the character of human history that emerged during the European Enlightenment and claimed to have reason on its side, though it was actually a secularized version of Christian providential history, and very often an ideological tool to excuse acts against non-European populations, colonization, enslavement, genocide. These were acts that, well, did not fit with the ethical principles representing moral progress that were being trumpeted by prominent European figures of the day, including many of the philosophers that are canonized in my own discipline, and are considered and taught as leading lights in the alleged march toward equality and freedom, without these aspects of their thought ever being mentioned. I taught a graduate course on philosophy of racism and philosophy and race in the summer, and we talked about some that I'm going to mention now. Locke and Hegel and Kant and J.S. Mill and Hume and Voltaire, and the racism was very much a part of their philosophy, and not a single student in their entire education up to they were mostly PhD students. Not a single student had been introduced to any of it, which I find appalling. Right, speaking of. John Locke. So such as John Locke, who rejected slavery, at least most forms of it in principle when writing about liberty, but invested in a slave trading company. That's all it was. It's not that he was invested in a company and they happened to do some slave trade. No, it was this was its seal. It was a Royal African Company. All it did was trade slaves. And who also was involved in colonial administration in the so-called New World and co-authored a constitution for one of the colonies, Carolina, that included giving a master, quote unquote, even the right of life and death over his slaves, which was going further than many did go at that time. Locke also argued for a concept of property that represented all of American land as belonging to no one. In the beginning, all the world was America, he writes. This is in a well-known chapter on property in his two treatises of government. For Locke, not only is it allowable to turn all of this waste into maximally productive property, which incidentally requires the invention of money, so that the yield that is excess to one's own needs can be sold, but it is a moral duty to do so, even a divine command. So it would seem that, God actually commands capitalism and a particular kind of enclosure and exploitation of land. And so, yeah, this became part of an argument, and Locke's arguments were used to dispossess Indians, as they were called at the time, of their land, because so he who appropriates land to himself by his labor does not lessen but increase the common stock of mankind. For the provision serving to the support of human life produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land are, to speak much with encompass, 10 times more those which are yielded by an acre of land of an equal richness lying waste in common. For I ask whether in the wild woods and uncultivated waste of America left to nature without any improvement, tillage, or husbandry, 1,000 acres yield the needy and wretched inhabitants many conveniences of life, as 10 acres equally fertile land do in Devonshire, where they are well cultivated. So the land is waste because, the Indians, okay, they're hunting and fishing there, and they do own the deer that they kill, the fish that they take from the river, but the land, no, they're not making it maximally productive, and it is a benefit to mankind. In fact, God wanted people to make it maximally productive, and he's got a section which I haven't quoted here, where he says people will not do that unless the people will not produce more than they need unless you have the opportunity to sell it, and for that you need a medium of exchange, money. So yeah, part of the progress of civilization then for Locke from the pre-civilized state like that of Indians, who supposedly did not cultivate land, although actually they did. They just didn't enclose it and cultivate quite the way that that Locke recognized, Locke and others recognized or wanted to recognize. So part of the progress of civilization is from what he imagined their kind of life to be. He thought of them as hunter-gatherers, to civilization, right? Which meant enclosing land and so on and so forth. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is that indeed, justice is another work that is critical of multiculturalism in relation to Indigenous peoples. And what I'm suggesting here is that indeed justice for Indigenous peoples and nations requires decolonization, and that is part of anti-racism. But theorizing this anti-racism accurately, capturing the wrongs and the remedies, requires attention to culture. Right. For one thing, it includes understanding some elements of quite profound cultural difference through listening and dialogue. This profound difference of world views, right? The Junaha case, it's pitched as religion, religious freedom versus secular law. But actually, when you look closely at it, that secular law, property law, right, is has particular assumptions, and they're Lockean type assumptions about property, about nature, about human relations to land and our responsibility for it. So you have that view, which is described as secular, right? And you have the Junaha's view, which is different, and with which many environmentalists sympathize, which is described as religious. And to get at the problem here, you've got to talk about culture. You know, you've got to talk about the deep cultural presuppositions of settler law. It's not neutral, right? It only looks neutral if you don't contrast it with something. You're not in dialogue with someone who thinks quite differently. Okay, so there's that, and also anti-racism. Decolonization for Indigenous peoples requires knowing and challenging the judgments about cultural superiority and inferiority that accompanied the history of European colonialism, with its views about spreading civilization to the barbarous and backward peoples in the rest of the world. Now, Locke was certainly racist, but had no concept of race. He was too early for that. A little too early for that. When biological race theory develops over the course of the 18th century, it claims to offer a biological basis for really what are pre-existing views of cultural superiority and inferiority. Consider, for instance, the racial taxonomy. The racial taxonomy at which Carl Linnaeus eventually arrives. Linnaeus invented the Latin binomial system of zoological and botanical taxonomy, which we still use today. His multi-volume work, the Systema Naturae, went through multiple editions. In the earlier ones, the division between human types was purely physical through phenotypical markers. But then it comes to include features of character, vices and virtues, buttressed by a theory of humors. So, you know, Homo europaeus is sanguine and muscular, and okay, there's also the physical markers, plenty of yellow hair and blue eyes, also light, wise, and inventor, which kind of goes with sanguine, right? Homo africanus, black, phlegmatic, lazy, and now you've got what are clearly moral defects, right? Sly, sluggish, neglectful, and kinds of societies that then arise from supposedly correlated with, but it comes to be that the biological race theory is an explanation for the kinds of societies that they have, right? So yeah, governed by choice, for instance, governed by customary right, and so on. Okay. Now, the racial typology was developed further by a number of scientists and philosophers. The line between these disciplines was not firmly drawn at the time. Immanuel Kant, for instance, was friends with and influenced Blumenbach, who is sometimes credited with inventing the full-blown scientific concept of race, though Blumenbach credited Kant as his source for that. And this is Kant's racial theory. He may have been the first, actually, to claim that the races, along with their ranked character, are permanent. He's the first person, it's the first writing in which I found that claim, and others say the same, that they can't be changed, the nature of the races can't be changed, except through miscegenation, i.e. interbreeding, of which, however, Kant disapproved, right? His theory was that there was an original race, the noble blonde form, and it was transplanted into various regions and produced 4 deviations. But his hypothesis is that they start out with seeds, you see. They have this, the original white race goes to these various regions, and it has these seeds, but the seeds then develop in different regions. And once they develop, they can't go back into embryonic form, so they can't change. Once they're developed, it's done, it's fixed. And so, yeah, so you get these 4 races that are fixed, right? No further climactic influences could cause one to change into another race. And here's some characterizations of the races in Kant's typology made in the course of his lectures on anthropology, which, you know, in his lifetime reached a larger audience than the works that are commonly studied today in philosophy classrooms, such as the Critique of Pure Reason. This ranking was connected to Kant's philosophy of history, which was a secularized version of Christian providential history. So now God's plan becomes the march of reason, and Christians by confession are replaced by white Europeans who contain by nature all of the talents, and so are the motor of progress within history, right? So the race of the whites contains all motives and talents. To the white race belong all of Europe, the Turk and the Kymlicka. If ever a revolution occurred, it was always brought about by the whites, and the Hindus, Americans, Negroes never had any part in it. Okay, he doesn't entirely emphatically, explicitly affirm slavery for quote unquote Negroes, but you know, he doesn't condemn it at a time when lots of people did. He was in conversation with people. He wasn't just a product of his time. He was in conversation with people who were arguing against him on the subject of race and on slavery. Right? So yeah. And the Americans, meaning Indigenous people, they speak hardly at all, care for nothing, and are lazy, right? What are you going to do? Okay, so that's Kant, right? And now, you get, I should mention, before moving on, a bit of a puzzle in Kant, because since the Europeans contain all of the talents and the motor of progress within history, they're the only ones who can reach the final destiny of mankind, final rational destiny of mankind. The others can only go so far, right? By nature, because they're lesser races and they're limited, and there's nothing that can be done about that, right? So the puzzle becomes for Kant, because he does have this secularized providential history. Why do they exist at all? And what's going to happen to them? And there is an unpublished note in which he speculates that they will all die out, and only the white race will remain to fulfill the destiny. The human essence. Okay, so when you get to Hegel, the explicitly biological race theory is generally absent. But the ranking and its content remains much the same. Here he is on Negroes, for instance, where the racial representations of Africans as between animal and human are replaced here by a historical conception of them as in a state of nature and therefore not historical. Negroes have no history for Hegel, and the role and they play no role in history, which is the unfolding of reason, though it looks suspiciously like the alleged manifest destiny of the white race. And this so we must lay aside all thought of reverence and morality. And by the way, Hegel's remarks on Negroes, on Africa and on Negroes, were read out in a proceeding in the US where slavery was being debated, and it was read out on the side of those who were against abolition. Okay, this common sort of tropes, right? Another characteristic fact in reference to Negroes is slavery. Negroes are enslaved by Europeans and sold to America. How does this may be? Their lot in their own land is even worse, since their slavery, quite as absolute, exists, where it is the essential principle of slavery that man has not yet attained a consciousness of his freedom. So they're no worse off by being enslaved by us. Among the Negroes, moral sentiments are quite weak, or more strictly speaking, non-existent. Parents sell their children, and conversely, children sell their parents, as either has opportunity. You know, like, look, this at a time when lots of people were screaming about the horrors of slavery and about about African families being separated, talking about their misery and how terrible this is. But yeah, somehow not people most canonized in my discipline, right? This is Hegel on China. Now, his passage on slavery excuses at least temporary enslavement of Africans by Europeans. He was in favor of abolition eventually. Everybody was. Nobody argued by that point that slavery should be permanent. But they argued that the debate was then, should it be immediate or should it be eventual? And basically people who wanted to continue it were, saying it should be gradual. Okay, here's Hegel in China and India, which do play some role in history, but cannot go the full distance. They have to be led to the end of human development by Europeans. Right, and he talks about a lack of proper reason, really, among these nations. And I find Hegel very interesting here because he is like the opposite of being a person of his times. I hate that kind of defense of these figures because it's often made by people who know nothing about the times. Right, they say this, and Hegel was writing in a period where there was a burgeoning of scholarship on India and on India, especially in Germany, on the Orient, especially in France. So there was a lot of enthusiasm actually for the cultures, the religions, and the inventions, the technological inventions of the country. Hegel is actually going against the grain and saying, no, right? I think he wants a certain picture, right? And this is inconvenient and it makes him anxious. That's my view of the matter. And I think something like Indian monism must have been upsetting for him because his own system is monistic too, right? So they can look similar. That he didn't want. Now, okay, just one last point on this though. So what you see reflected in the history of philosophy, these few highlights that I've picked up, or lowlights if you like, is that there were superioristic attitudes and cultural rankings of non-Europeans. Then these were supported by biological race theory. Then the biological race theory falls away. But the Euro supremacism and cultural ranking remains the same, accompanied by a sense of the white man's burden. So really, there is nothing neo about neo-racism. Western racism has always been cultural, let's say. And this means, I've been implying, that anti-racism has to include correcting that cultural supremacist lens. I understand multiculturalism to be part of this project in countries where white people, white is a constructed category again, as all racial classifications are, coexist with non-white, i.e. racialized people in the same nation or federation. So I've already talked a bit about what that means for Indigenous peoples within Canada. It should be apparent how I'll underline this point, right? It should be apparent how, in that case, it's not remotely the same as theorizing the implications for a national minority using Kymlicka's terms such as Quebec. It's a very different situation. Quebec's history and situation in relation to English Canada involves inequalities and domination, sure, but it's not a product of racist settler colonialism. Rather, France was an agent in the process of this colonization of the part of Turtle Island, as some Indigenous people call it, that became Canada, as was England. Quebec Francophones who trace their ancestral history to that colonization and back originally to France are not victims of racism. Rather, they are more likely to be agents against racialized groups, Indigenous people, as well as immigrants. Here, it's a peculiar fact, I would note, that support for Bill 21 in Quebec. This is a bill that prohibits the wearing of religious symbols by public employees and is now law. Similar such legislation in France and Quebec follows that hardline model of laicite. It's a peculiar fact that support for this bill came largely from Francophones and especially Catholics. It's not supported by Anglophones. I mean, it has minority support among Anglophones, and not by atheists. Right. So this is peculiar if you suppose Law 21 is about defending a laicite, that is. I mean, if it's about defending the strictly secular character of the state, you would think that Catholics would be critical of it, right? And you would think that atheists would be in favor, but it's the other way around. So that seems odd if you think it's about laicite, but it's not odd if you think it's about racism. So yeah, if you see the law is motivated in particular by Islamophobia, then it's not peculiar, and it's only then veiled as secularism. It does seem to have been largely aimed at Muslim women, and it's popularly known as a hijab ban. It does, I mean, it does also affect Sikhs who wear turbans and Jews who wear kippah, but concern seems to have been about Muslim women. Okay, and according to a study whose findings were published last year, the law has in fact increased racism, particularly against Muslim women, but also directed at other racialized minorities, Sikhs and South Asians generally. Anti-Semitism also increased. This study, which noted these the hate incidents and the levels of negative change, actually talked to minorities, which and it asked them about their experiences and perceptions, which far too many studies and consultative processes do not, including even an academic scholarship on multiculturalism and minority rights in Canada, which I find astonishing. It asks the majority, more or less, are you racist? I mean, a little more, subtle than that, but more or less that. And guess what? They say no. Well, yeah, but that's not how this works. This is religion rather than race, you might think, but virtually, all of the cases involving claims for accommodation, exemption, change in Canada in relation to existing laws or policies on behalf of minorities have involved religion. For instance, Baltej Singh Dhillon, who successfully fought for the right to wear a turban instead of the standard cap that was part of the uniform in Canada's federal police, or the case of Rania El-Alou, whom a Quebec judge refused to hear unless she removed her headscarf, her hat. She said there are no hats allowed in my courtroom. And decisions in legal cases, such as in the case of Multani, which was a case involving a Sikh boy who wanted the right to wear a kirpan to school. And it was really a horrible kirpan. It was blunt, it was sewn into a sheath, not usable. It just slipped out one day, and so some people made a fuss, and it went to court. And the Supreme Court decision, which was in favor of Multani, made reference to multiculturalism as a Canadian value. And I find this quote quite interesting because, it said that just banning the kirpan was disrespectful to believers in the Sikh religion and does not take into account Canadian values based on multiculturalism. Religious tolerance is a very important value of Canadian society. Accommodating he was a minor at the time and he wasn't identified, and allowing him to wear his kirpan under certain conditions demonstrates the importance that our society attaches to protecting freedom of religion and to showing respect for its minorities. So there's no bright line drawn in this decision, this reasoning between religion and culture. And both we need to recognize intersect with race, and there's appeal to multiculturalism. Okay, but all of the cases involving multiculturalism in Canada, virtually all, have been about religion. I mean, it's not that you can separate the two very well, right? Gurraj Singh Multani eventually left Quebec for government employment in Ontario. He reported in 2013 that a ban on wearing religious symbols would be a problem for him. Later in 2020, he also said that he suffered from not being able to attend French school for 6 years while this case was going on. And you basically can't get a job in the public sector in Quebec without French fluency. Well, I have always understood Canadian multiculturalism as affirming that you can be fully unambiguously Canadian without being white. Where that includes having a connection to a historical culture that is not European, where that connection is, in one way or another, a component of your identity. And I've said that in a conversation I had with Tariq some months ago, that in my family, so growing up, we immigrated in 69 or thereabouts, and over the course of the 70s, we thought multiculturalism was a great thing, and we thought it was directed at us, and we absolutely perceived it as being about racism, and we perceived it as saying that you can be from wherever, and you can speak your language, and you can, people shouldn't be prejudiced against you because of the clothes that you wear. But it was very much about, us as racialized Canadians, right? Like it didn't affect immigrants from Italy or Greece, right? Who always, of course, celebrated their heritage, and proud of their food and had festivals, and so on. And they were proud of that. They didn't worry about it because, well, they didn't encounter racism, right? So yeah, although it's been said that multiculturalism had to do with Trudeau trying to diffuse Quebec nationalism, I'm not so sure. That's certainly not the way in which it was rolled out, and not the way in which it was perceived by a lot of racialized immigrants, at least in Canada. And here, as my final point, I want to refer to a paper that I wrote a long time ago that brought together reflection on the relation to cultural identity of Indigenous communities and non-white immigrant groups, by which I mean groups composed of people who connect their identities in one way or another with non-Western peoples and nations. It was called Learning to be Indian. This is way back in 2004. It was actually my first foray into philosophical analysis of cultural identity, and also the first time I engaged with Tariq's work, of which I've remained a fan ever since. It raised a puzzle posed by theories of multiculturalism that work with pre-existing cultural difference, such as Kymlicka's, but many others as well. Now, I've been using Kymlicka as an example, but I don't want this to be just a critique of him. That's a lot of multicultural theory. The puzzle was, for me, that these theories couldn't explain movements to reinvigorate cultures, which are very powerful in Indigenous writings and activism. Recall that the blog post I mentioned at the start of this talk mentions inadequate government funding for learning Indigenous languages. Now, thick theories about how culture shapes values and outlooks have always taken language to be central to that shaping, and multicultural theories have adopted that. But in Canada, most Indigenous individuals do not grow up speaking or hearing the native language of the community to which they belong. They grow up speaking English or French, the cultures of their ancestors having been, submerged, and bits remain in fragments, but torn, at least, by settler colonialism. They often seek to revive those cultures which they see as their own, even though they were not raised in them. And they speak of reconnecting with their roots, which I find an interesting phrase. It's common use, but if you think about it, it's peculiar, right? roots that you didn't have, but now you would like to have, right? You could just reconnect with them. And immigrants talk about that too, quite often. They often seek to, so the title Learning to be Indian is a quote from an Indigenous person engaged in this effort to reconnect with their roots. They said, I'm learning to be Indian. And it touched me because at the time I wrote this, I was also learning to be Indian, the other kind of Indian from India. As I have been ever since, like I'm much more Indian now than I was then. At the time I wrote this article, I had been asking myself, why? I mean, since my parents emigrated when I was not yet 6 years old and I was raised in Canada, why did I think I was Indian? Why did I even want to reconnect with this culture, relearn the language that I learned first, understand its history? I mean, why did I regard any of this as mine at all? And one part of the answer at which I arrived involved the further question, as opposed to what? You know, why do I identify myself as Indian? As opposed to what? The other options on the table were languages and traditions descended from Europe, predominantly England. Yes, I grew up with them and was fluent in them and have been shaped by them. My first degree was actually in English literature, but being a brown person from India, I was not psychologically able and did not want to identify with the subjects for racist colonial history. That would be weird. People would even think it was weird, right? They would think I was, they would think I should get some therapy if I did that, if I thought of myself as English, right? I mean, why should I identify myself as English? How can I? When my parents lived through partition as children, and I grew up feeling the weight of the liberation struggle. And also when I experienced racism growing up in Canada. And here I cited data from some of Tariq's earlier work with Sharon Aishan and Satnam Virti. It was presented in Changing Ethnic Identities and reported that in their study conducted in 1993 in Britain, most of the Asian second-generation individuals surveyed wanted the original languages of their communities taught to future generations, even when they themselves did not speak these languages well, and did not need to do so for effective communication. So my general point here is that people imagine who they are in terms of the narrative options with which they are presented, and racism is an important factor in this imagination. Because I wrote then, they should not have to renounce or pretend to renounce who they are, who they cannot help but imagine themselves to be in the context of the larger society in which they live. Nor, of course, should they be exposed to contempt or exclusion as a result. They should not be denied the opportunity to shape their own future in a manner that accords with their understanding of themselves as members of a community whose identity is defined through a particular shared past. That, I think, is another important argument for multiculturalism as an essential component of anti-racism for racialized immigrant communities, as well as for Indigenous peoples. That they cannot fully identify with and should not have to fully identify with the majority culture, which is, for instance, English or French. It's not a non-culture, right? It's not just Canadian either. It is European. Okay, so in sum, here's why I think multiculturalism must be anti-racist and anti-racism must be multicultural. So for Indigenous people, the history of settler colonialism has to be recognized, and that anti-racism requires recognizing that, decolonizing, but that means unsettling the anthropology of primitive and advanced. An anthropology, I would say, that subtly is still with us. And it means recognizing land claims and cultural difference, and all of that has everything to do with race. The reason we don't recognize that cultural difference, the reason it doesn't have status and dignity, is this long history of denigration. For African Canadians or Americans, the history of slavery has to be recognized. It has to be recognized when we're talking about anti-racism and also multiculturalism. But what also has to be done is to dismantle prejudices about uncivilized Africa. And I find it interesting that Black philosophers in Canada and the US, I can think of two actually in Canada, who work on anti-racism, also work on Africana philosophy. Both the ones that I have in mind. So that seems to be part of it for them. And I think it needs to be. For Asian immigrants, one has to think in terms of cultural rankings and stereotypes. Yeah, one has to look at forms of racism like Islamophobia, which are not biological. There are forms of cultural racism, and they hide behind talk of culture, right? And discourses about religion and so forth. Multiculturalism, which doesn't recognize the racism in the situation of these particular groups, is going to be flawed. Okay, and racism, which doesn't take on board the need to talk about culture in relation to these groups, is going to be inadequate. And for all racialized groups, I think we need to look at the role of racism in their imagination of identity, their imagination of their own and their own identity, right? There's a reason why Indigenous people, Black people, Asians turn to their cultures and want to learn more about them and to be more positive about them, right? Their cultures, even though they didn't grow up in them, but they still regard them as theirs in some way, even though they may have connected with only fragments through their families, right? Very, very little. But that's still who they are, because who else can they be? In a Eurocentric racist society. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That was fascinating, and it covered so many different kind of ranged across wide number of themes and topics and in different registers, but I thought it had so many interesting parts to it. So we now obviously can have some discussion and Q&A, both for those of you who are online, if you indicate by raising a hand, making yourself visible and raising a hand, that would be good.
Screen share?
Yeah, if you could put the gallery on, and also here for people who want to make a contribution or ask a question. Yeah, we just wait a moment. Are we ready?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I just moved it out so everyone can
Thanks.
see.
Thanks, Lauren. Maybe when you ask a question, just say who you are. People on the screen, we can see their name, but not here. So introduce yourself when you ask a question. Go ahead.
Cecile.
Okay.
Just wondering, so using multiculturalism as together with the anti-racism, why wouldn't the colonial frame? Does it function differently by looking at these realities? Because here, anti-racism is the reality of them together.
Yeah,
seems to be a bit in the past, and I would say a bit sort of before, whereas now it's these two things functioning here. But yeah,
Oh, it's the same in Canada, and multiculturalism is people ask, right, about is it fading away or has it been supplanted by decolonization and so on. But my point was that decolonization still has to talk about culture, right? And anti-racism has to talk about culture at so many levels, right? So in telling the history of colonization, but also in thinking about what is needed for restoration, because part of what's needed for restoration is respect for culture, right? So, I mean, that is something that multiculturalism had recognized, but I think that multicultural theory in Canada and the way that it talked about Indigenous peoples by assimilating their situation to Quebec. You're not talking about race. That was problematic. So it's not that I'm not at all saying that decolonization should be supplanted by multiculturalism, right? But I'm saying that culture has to be a part of it. We can't abandon that.
Well, I'll put something in while people are thinking about taking their own question. Now, it may be that Cecile and I might not quite agree on this. I don't know. I don't want to judge too much from a small remark you made, but I think the problem that you identify in Canadian multiculturalism doesn't really exist in British multiculturalism, and partly for historical reasons. So in Canada, the kind of first, what we might call equality perspective in relation to minorities and including non-white minorities was multiculturalism. And then people began to think, well, hang on a minute, it doesn't properly address anti-racism. And that's now become, quite a significant theme in Canadian discussions. Whereas in Britain, we started the other way around. We started with a focus on color racism and racial discrimination and laws and policies in relation to that and anti-racism. And multiculturalism came later, and partly as a way of including anti-racism, but including things that a color-based anti-racism wouldn't get any traction on, including exactly some of the things you were talking about, especially at the end about issues to do with brown people and their sense of identity related to ancestral descent and their social location in a white society that they belonged to and wanted to belong to, but couldn't belong to it in the same way as their white peers. So I think we don't have that problem, but that's not to say that there aren't lots of tensions. And other people would tell the story in a different way. And then now people talk about, decoloniality and so on. So, but the question I really wanted to ask was the one that you began with, the article, the blog that you began with, because it was really interesting. So that person, Kathija, wanted to say multiculturalism is not anti-racism because it doesn't include anti-racism. And you wanted to say, well, actually, you have a point, but there's nothing about multiculturalism that can't include anti-racism. Moreover, a proper, as you know, your rest of your lecture showed, a proper, effective anti-racism in theory and in practice has to engage with the cultural dimensions of racism and the cultural dimensions of identities that would exist if racism would allow them to exist. So that kind of means that there's actually the potential for a lot of potential for meeting in the middle. And so who has got any incentive in wanting to separate out anti-racism and multiculturalism, and what would their reasons be for doing so?
Well, that blog post said more than that, because it also said that multiculturalism, and this is something commonly here, actually, that multiculturalism is is obfuscating and therefore making it harder to address racism, right? That there is this multicultural feel-good rhetoric of, okay, you know, we acknowledge everybody's cultural differences, and it's not getting at the racism. So she was saying that. I'm not sure that multiculturalism in practice is quite as responsible as she says. I mean, yeah, there may be people who say, you know, look at how great we get along, and actually there's all these inequalities. But I don't think multiculturalism is at fault for that. People do that, right? They do that in other countries too. So yeah, and I think that we have some problems with the way in which multicultural theories have been formulated, right? But I think if you look at governmental policy, it's a little bit different. I don't think it's quite the way that you've described it, because I think, so if you look at it, even at the wording of the Canadian Multiculturalism Act, it talks about religion, it talks about race, it talks about ethnic origin. You know, that's all in there. So I think that that understand, you know, so it's about like including people regardless of their race, their ethnic origin, and so on, and recognizing that, right, rather than people having to hide it. So I think that was always there, but somehow in the theorizing, it didn't get taken up.
And any suggestion as to why that might have happened? Because we'd expect, in general, our kind of view is, well, theorists have a broader canvas, you know, broader imagination and broader intellectual perspectives. They'd see more, not see less. So how is it that politicians were ahead?
See Quebec. So you know, who are the big names in multiculturalism in Canada? Charles Taylor and Will Kymlicka, right? And both of them were heavily focused on Quebec. And that's a very different kind of case. And so they tended to extrapolate from the kinds of distinct society that Quebec wanted. They drew lessons from that. They drew analogies from that to talk about Indigenous nations, peoples, and immigrant groups. And I think that was a mistake.
Yeah. Anyone online want to come in? As I say, please indicate by making yourself visible, putting your hand up, or anyone in the room. And you're entitled to come back, Cecile, if you want to.
Okay, really. Formula, I haven't got.
May I ask?
Yes.
Question, a case that always interested me in the contemporary Canadian context is that of Ishak versus Canada, a woman who wanted to wear the full face veil during her citizenship ceremony. The Supreme Court ruled in her favor. That was a number of years ago, and I know
The Harper government.
yeah, and the Harper government was going to launch an appeal against the Supreme Court's decision. So I don't know where that case went, whether the Harper government successfully appealed the case, but also I would also be interested in finding out what the Ishak case looks like from your perspective. I mean, there was a kind of crude perception in some of the stuff I was reading, which was Ishak saying, well, if you say you're tolerant of multicultural diversity, you should let me veil, which the response was something like, well, because we're tolerant, you shouldn't. Or the kind of racist response to her claim. I don't know how that looked like from your perspective. Like,
I don't know quite how that went. I mean, you know, the sort of reasons that were given for why she couldn't veil are just silly. So many of the reasons that were given generally for why it was so important for Muslim women to show their face all kind of disappeared after COVID, right? Because wearing these masks, and you know what, it was fine. And you could, yeah. So, a lot of that more kind of extreme stuff that was around at that time went away with Harper. Right, so I don't actually know what was the trajectory of that particular case. But Trudeau has been, his father, much less hostile towards immigrants who refuse to be like us. So yeah, but of course, I mean, there are just these Islamophobic perceptions around the kind of associations that people have with veiling the perceptions of gender inequality and so on and so forth. And it's, I mean, that's very weird. I find the fact that this particular thing, what it is that women choose to wear on their heads, right, or on their faces, has become such a huge flashpoint in Western countries. It ought to be simple, even on basic liberal principles. It's not something that proposes any burden or risk on anybody else, and that should be that. So, and I think if you want to answer the question, why has it become such a flashpoint, you can't do it without looking at Orientalism, the history of Orientalism, and what kinds of weird associations people have with this. There's a nice article I refer to a lot by I know her so well, forgotten her last name, called the veil on our heads and in their minds. And yeah, it unpacks all of this really nicely.
And Armenia, we can see you. Is that because you'd like to ask a question? No.
I just wanted to actually not to be completely silent and thank the speakers. Thank you so much. But I can ask a question. I'm not really an expert in the topic. I come from urban studies. And generally, I'm interested in terms of how the two concepts are materialized in urban setting in a way that we can question them. And I have seen the difference of materialization of the two concepts in the Nordic context, specifically in Sweden and a little bit now in the UK, which are different. That was one of my questions, in case there is any, if it makes sense, and if you have any, if you would like to contribute to that. And the second one, sorry, I just remembered that I can ask another question, quick one, is that as much as I understand, the anti-racist kind of concept is embeds the kind of power dynamic in it. And the multiculturalism is it sounds neutral in a way. And I wanted to ask, in societies like in the UK or in Sweden, which the places that I have experienced living, apart from my home country, is how about the countries that have a complete imbalanced nationality, where the majority, there is a majority that has a specific dominant culture and race, and can we discuss the two without talking about power and kind of the power of the dominance, I meant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I always took it that I mean, one of the points, and maybe the whole point of multiculturalism, was to challenge that dominance, right? And to insist on equality. I mean, that is built into Canadian multiculturalism, and that I think even in the theories, right? So yeah, that's supposed to be very much part of it. What that means in practice, I mean, like, look, in Canada, multiculturalism has also meant, for instance, representation in public professions. So here's something that we commonly do attribute to multiculturalism, and it is about power. That you see that you have enough Black and brown and Indigenous faces in government, but also on television, right? And in just prominent positions of power and visibility. And that does help to challenge power. But I mean, it is true that this has to go along with measures to improve economic equality. So, I mean, a multiculturalism that just talks about power and doesn't talk about economic integration and equalities, yeah, certainly not helping, and it is in fact covering over the problem. Sorry, I'm not sure about the first question.
That's okay. It was just generally talking about how these concepts being materialized in for example, in urban setting, in cities, because multiculturalism in my field is very much leading the design and the planning of cities, as if it can become visible by the diversity and by representation. However, the anti-racism is more political, is more, or let's say it's more abstract. And so I just wondered if that can have some material representation that
Well, I
we are
certainly
not
see
aware of.
that kind of diversification that you're talking about as part of anti-racism and part of decolonization. I'm thinking in Canada, in Ottawa, where I live, that are a very major museum, which is visible from a very long distance across the river, has an Indigenous design. It was done by an Indigenous designer, and it incorporates the design of the boats, actually. And the Great Hall also has Indigenous sculptures in it. And, bringing that kind of thing into the city in a very visible way. Yeah, I think that's part of multiculturalism, and I think it's anti-racist too.
Sorry, may I interrupt? I think in your opening remarks, you also mentioned Black Canadians suffering from segregation, which I assumed you meant spatialized segregation within cities. So that's an instance that might talk to what Ellie's talking about when she talks about materialization of these practices in Canadian context. I think that's right.
Yeah, of racism. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. And I mean, an anti-racism would involve ameliorating the economic conditions. I'm not. I don't immediately assume that because people of certain groups, like some immigrant groups, form neighborhoods that are predominantly of that immigrant group. I don't see that as necessarily a reflection of racism, or as anything that you want to oppose.
In one implication in relation to Eli's question about urban planning, for instance, is transportation. So when you do an analysis of metropolitan cities and metropolitan areas, you often find that neighborhoods where there's this concentration of low-income families and people, which often are disproportionately non-white, ethnic minority, they have much worse transport infrastructure to allow them to get to where the jobs are, for instance. So I would imagine both an anti-racist monitoring or a multiculturalist reflection on transport policy would be, is it equitable in terms of those kinds of neighborhoods, or is it just, as it were, giving more resources to neighborhoods that are already quite well resourced in terms of their transport access? That could be a possibility. I think we soon be able to go and have a drink and carry the conversation over a drink. But before you rush off anywhere, Lauren, I've got a final question to put to you, Sonia, and that is, so it partly relates to my last one about why the political theorists seem to be starting in a slightly different place to where the politicians already got to, where law and policy was already going. One of the places your lecture ended up was by saying, look, culture and race can't be disentangled in what we're talking about, but then nor can culture and religion. So culture, race, religion, these are overlapping and interlocking concepts when it comes to the kinds of equalities and exclusions we're talking about. And of course, I totally agree with that. But I just then wanted to say that the theorists, the Canadian eminent political theorists, didn't simply under-recognize race and racism, but they also under-recognized the role of religion and religious identity. And relating that to your history of philosophy and racism in the history of philosophy. So there's a book that came out last year by Kymlicka. I can't remember the title, but you know, some of you may know it, or we can certainly look it up. Came out last year by Kymlicka. And he argued, you know, quite persuasively, I thought, that there's an Enlightenment tradition, which he referred to as kind of moderate Enlightenment, which does have some of the people that were in your story, like Locke and Kant, perhaps also Hume, perhaps also Hegel. And he said, and yes, a lot of them, though it's not central to their philosophies, but a lot of them shared racist ideas and expressed them in their work. But he argued that there's an alternative Enlightenment tradition, which he refers to as the radical Enlightenment, and they were actually anti-racists. I can't remember all the people he mentioned, but Diderot is one that he mentioned. But the problem I have with that is that most of his radical Enlightenment heroes, who he says were anti-racist and anti-slavery, were also anti-religion. So we then are forced with the choice of identifying a philosophical tradition that is more anti-racist, or a philosophical tradition that's more sympathetic to the inclusion of religious groups in secular Enlightenment societies. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
My thought on that is Johann Gottfried Herder.
Herder.
Herder, yeah, on whom I've worked for a long time, but on whom I wrote. And so he is, I mean, he has his own flaws, you know, because he is the sort of founder of the idea of cultural nationalism. But for him, it was a bulwark against colonialism and imperialism. He argued with Kant on race and said we should not use this ugly word. Every people is a people and has their culture. He was a cleric. You know, was a religious cleric, but with a humble sort of view of Christianity, and he was against conversion.
And of course, you could call him a kind of patron saint of multiculturalism. Good. Well, that's a very happy thought to end on then. Why don't we thank Sonia in the usual way and go and have a drink with her? I hope you'll all join us. Thank you very much. And thank you to the people who joined us online.
And we're recording and I'll show you all where we're going.
Great, thank you.